The village rested quietly beneath the weight of the mountains. Its homes, built from dark wood and softened by time, stood close together along narrow earthen paths. Beyond them, the land rose slowly into shadowed hills where tall grasses moved in gentle patterns beneath the evening wind. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and damp soil, and somewhere far beyond the fields, water slipped quietly over stone. Evening arrived without urgency. The sky shifted from pale golden to muted blue, and the first lantern was lit near the edge of the village. Its glow was small, steady, and warm against the growing dusk. Then another followed, and another. One by one, the lights appeared, not bright enough to challenge the night, but enough to welcome it. Doors began to close soon after, softly, without sound beyond the quiet slide of wood against wood. Voices lowered, not suddenly, but as though the air itself asked for gentleness. Footsteps grew lighter, movements slowed. The rhythm of the village changed in a way that no one needed to notice, yet everyone followed. It was not silence that came, it was stillness, a different thing entirely. Beyond the final row of houses, a narrow road curved along the edge of the open fields. During the day, it was a simple path. Villagers crossed it without thought. Children ran along it, their steps uneven and quick, the marks of carts and sandals pressed into its surface, layering over one another until no single path remained clear. It led to familiar places, the river, the hills, the distant tree line. There was nothing unusual about it, but when the light faded, and the last traces of the day withdrew into the mountains, the road seemed to change, not in form, not in shape, but in presence. The space around it deepened, the edges felt less certain, as though the path extended farther than it should, slipping quietly beyond the boundaries of the land. There were nights when nothing came of it. The wind would continue to move, the lantern flames would flicker gently, the sound of insects and distant water would remain steady, filling the dark with quiet life. Those nights passed without notice. They belonged to the village, but there were other nights when the wind would fall still, completely. The grasses beyond the road would stop moving, as though held in place by something unseen. The air would grow heavier not in weight, but in presence. The small sounds of the world would fade, one by one, until even the faintest echo seemed to withdraw into the distance. And in that stillness, something remained, not sound, not movement, but something quieter than both. The lantern flames would no longer flicker. They would hold, perfectly still, as though the air itself had forgotten how to move. Inside the homes, nothing appeared different. Meals were finished, voices softened. The quiet routines of the evening continued as they always had, and yet, beneath those ordinary moments, there was an understanding, not spoken, not explained, but carried, passed gently from one generation to the next without ever becoming a story. There was only a phrase, simple, unchanging. If the night grows too still, do not look toward the road. It was not spoken often, and when it was, it came quietly, like something remembered rather than taught. Children heard it without question, travelers heard it without understanding, and those who had lived long enough in the village carried it within them, like a habit they had never chosen, yet never abandoned, because there had been moments, uncertain, moments when someone had remained awake just a little too long, when someone had stepped outside without thinking, when someone had allowed their gaze to drift, just slightly, toward the road beyond the reach of the lantern light, and in that stillness something had been seen, not clearly, never all at once, only fragments, a faint glow far in the distance, a shape that did not move like anything familiar, a presence that passed without sound, yet left the air changed behind it. By morning, nothing remained. The road returned to its ordinary form. The wind moved again. The village continued as it always had, but the memory did not disappear. It settled, quietly, like everything else in that place, And so the understanding remained. There are nights that do not belong to humans. There are paths that are not meant to be watched, and when the world grows still enough, something begins to move. Morning returned without memory of the night. Light moved gently across the slopes of the mountains, touching their edges before drifting down into the village below. The air was cool and clear, carrying the quiet scent of damp earth and distant cedar. For a brief moment, everything remained still, as though the world itself had not yet decided to begin. Then, as it always did, the day unfolded. A wooden door slid open. Footsteps followed. Somewhere along the narrow paths, another door opened. Then another. The village stirred not with noise, but with rhythm slow, familiar, and unbroken. The sounds of the morning rose gradually, layering over one another until the stillness of the night was replaced by something softer, more alive. Fishermen stepped toward the river with woven baskets resting against their backs. Their movements were steady, practiced, guided by repetition rather than thought. Farmers followed, walking beyond the houses toward the open fields, their tools carried with quiet ease. Smoke began to rise from the rooftops, thin at first, then more steady. It drifted upward before dissolving into the pale sky, leaving behind the faint scent of cooking fires and warmed grain. The village, which had folded into itself during the night, now opened again without hesitation. Children moved along the path soon after. Their steps were lighter, less certain, yet filled with energy that did not need direction. They crossed the road without pause, their feet pressing small, uneven marks into the earth. Their voices carried farther than the voices of the adults, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to belong entirely to the day. The road beyond the houses held their footprints for a while, small impressions layered over older ones, evidence of movement, of presence, of life continuing without interruption. Nothing about it suggested that it could become anything else. And yet, even in the clear light of morning, there were quiet details that did not belong entirely to the day. At the entrance of each home, small charms hung beside the doorways. They were simple things: twisted rope bound tightly and darkened with age, folded paper creased in precise shapes that had been repeated for generations, small wooden pieces, worn smooth by time and touch. They moved gently when the wind passed, turning just slightly before settling again. No one adjusted them, no one examined them. They were not new, and they were not questioned. They simply remained, as they always had. The sun rose higher. Light filled the spaces between the houses, softening the edges of shadows and warming the narrow paths beneath it. The distant hills lost their darkness, revealing the quiet patterns of grass and stone that had been hidden during the night. Time moved forward without resistance. Work continued. Voices carried. The village lived. And as the morning gave way to midday, and midday began its slow descent into afternoon, nothing appeared out of place. The road remained ordinary. The wind moved freely. The world felt complete. Yet beneath that calm, there was something else, not visible, not spoken, but present. A quiet understanding carried in the way people moved, in the way they avoided lingering too long near the edges of the village, in the way the road, though crossed many times during the day, was never treated as a place to remain. It was something that was used, not something that was kept. And as the light began to soften once more, and the long shadows of the evening stretched slowly across the land, the rhythm of the village shifted again, not suddenly, not noticeably, but steadily, as though the day itself had begun to fold, and something quieter had begun to return. The afternoon thinned slowly into evening. Light softened across the fields, losing its brightness as it settled into warmer tones. The distant hills, once clear and defined, began to blur gently into the horizon, their edges fading into shadow as the sun lowered itself behind them. The change was quiet, so quiet that it often passed unnoticed. But within the village, It was always understood. Work began to slow, not because it needed to be finished, but because it had reached its natural end. The fishermen returned first, their steps steady but heavier now, their baskets filled with the quiet result of the day. Farmers followed, leaving the open fields behind as the light stretched long across the land. The rhythm of movement shifted, voices softened, footsteps lost their urgency, and though nothing was said, the village began to turn inward. Lanterns were prepared before they were lit, placed at doorways, hung beneath wooden beams, set carefully where their light would fall just enough to guide, but not enough to disturb the coming night. They remained unlit for a while, waiting. The sky deepened, gold faded into amber, amber into blue, and with that slow change, something else settled across the village, a quiet awareness, subtle, unspoken, but present in every movement. Children who had once run freely along the paths were called back without being called. Their laughter, which had carried openly through the air, became softer, then shorter, before fading entirely into the spaces between the houses. Doors were left slightly open, but not for long. One by one, they closed, gently, without sound. Windows followed, covered lightly, not sealed, just enough to soften what lay beyond them. The final light of the sun slipped behind the mountains without resistance. For a brief moment, the sky held a faint glow, distant and quiet, before giving way to the deeper tones of evening. The first lantern was lit soon after, a small flame, steady, warm, then another, and another, until the village was marked by scattered points of light, each one holding its place against the growing dark. The road beyond the houses grew empty. Where footsteps had crossed it throughout the day, there was now only stillness. The marks left behind remained, but no new ones appeared. The grass along its edges no longer bent beneath movement. It stood, unmoved. A breeze passed once, softly. It moved through the grasses, brushing lightly against the edges of the path. Then it stopped, completely. The lantern flames, which had flickered gently moments before, now held steady, unmoving, as though the air itself had stilled around them. The silence that followed was different from the silence of rest. It did not belong to sleep. It belonged to something else, something deeper. Inside the homes, the villagers settled into the night. Meals were finished without lingering, voices lowered further, not from caution, but from understanding. The quiet routines of the evening continued as they always had, yet each movement carried a subtle restraint. No one stepped outside, no one remained near the doorways, and no one looked toward the road. There was no need to remind anyone. The knowledge was already there. Beyond the reach of the lantern light, the road curved gently into darkness. Its shape remained the same, its path unchanged, but its presence felt different. The space along it seemed to stretch farther than it should, as though it extended beyond the land it crossed. The darkness did not simply cover it, it deepened it, giving it a sense of distance that could not be measured. The stillness grew heavier, not in weight, but in presence, as though something unseen had settled into the space, waiting without movement, without sound. And within that stillness, something began to shift, not visibly, not in a way that could be named, but in a way that could be felt. A quiet change in the air, a subtle turning of the world itself, as though the village had stepped back and something older had stepped forward. There were things the village did not explain, not because they were unknown, but because they had never needed to be spoken in full. The understanding lived quietly within daily life, carried through habit rather than instruction. It appeared in small gestures, subtle, repeated, and rarely noticed unless one looked for them with care. The charms at each doorway were one such sign. They were not placed there for decoration, nor were they new. Many had remained in the same position for years, their fibers darkened by time, their edges softened by weather. Some had been replaced, but only when they had begun to fall apart, and even then, they were remade in the same way, with the same shapes, the same careful folds. No one spoke of their purpose, yet no one removed them. At the edge of the village, where the road curved toward the fields, a small wooden post stood partially hidden by tall grass. It held nothing, no sign, no marking, only the faint impression of something that had once been tied to it. Most passed by without noticing, but those who had lived long enough knew it had always been there, and that it marked something not meant to be crossed at certain times. The elders spoke little. Their voices were quiet even during the day, and when they shared stories, they did so in fragments, not long tales, but small pieces, observations, reminders, half-finished thoughts that seemed to end before they revealed too much. It was not that they wished to hide anything. It was simply the way things had always been carried. One evening, as the light softened and the village began its slow return toward stillness, an older voice was heard near the edge of a narrow path. Not loud, not urgent, but clear. Do not remain outside when the night becomes too quiet. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, and yet they were heard. A younger presence paused nearby, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. There was a silence that followed the words, as though something more might be added, but nothing came. The elders simply turned away, returning toward the dim glow of the lantern-lit homes. The meaning remained unexplained. Later, as the sky deepened and the first lanterns were lit, another phrase surfaced, spoken even more quietly. If you hear something on the road, pause. Do not listen for it. The words drifted into the air and settled there, without echo, without response. They were not discussed, not questioned. They simply became part of the evening, carried alongside the fading light and the growing stillness. There were no stories of what had happened, no detailed accounts, only the suggestion of something that should not be known too clearly. And yet, the warnings remained precise, not exaggerated, not uncertain. They did not speak of danger in loud terms. They did not describe harm. They did not attempt to frighten. Instead, they guided, gently, as one might guide a hand away from something delicate, rather than dangerous. Inside the homes, as the night settled further, these quiet fragments found their place, not as thoughts to be considered, but as part of the rhythm of the village itself. A door closed a little earlier. A window was covered a little more fully. A lantern was placed just slightly farther from the edge of the path. Each action small, each one deliberate, and beyond the reach of the village. The road remained silent, unlit, unwatched. It did not demand attention. It did not call out, but its presence lingered, even in absence, as though it existed in two ways at once, as a path during the day, and as something else entirely when the world grew quiet enough. The warnings were never meant to be understood completely, only followed, because there are things that do not need to be seen to be real, and there are paths that, once noticed in the wrong way, cannot be unseen. The warnings were never gathered in one place. They did not form a single story, nor did they follow a clear beginning or end. Instead, they lingered in fragments, small pieces of understanding that drifted quietly through the village, carried in passing moments rather than deliberate teaching. They appeared in the space between actions, in the pause before a door was closed, in the brief hesitation before a lantern was placed, in the way a gaze turned away from the road without thought, as though guided by something deeper than intention. Children grew up hearing them without realizing they had been told anything at all. A phrase spoken softly while a meal was prepared, a quiet reminder given while the sky was still light, a gentle redirection when curiosity drifted too far toward the edge of the village. Not that way. Not tonight. Come inside before it grows too quiet. The words were simple, unremarkable, and yet, over time, they shaped something within those who heard them. Not fear, but awareness, a sense of boundary, of knowing where one belonged and where one did not. There was one phrase, however, that remained clearer than the others. It was not spoken often, and when it was, It carried a stillness of its own. If you see them, the sentence would begin, then pause, as though the rest did not wish to follow. Do not let them see you. It was never explained who they were. The word was left without form, without image, without detail. And perhaps that was why it remained, because what is not fully defined cannot be dismissed. It lingers, quietly, at the edge of thought. For travelers, the words were more difficult to understand. They would arrive in the village during the day, passing along the road without noticing anything unusual. The land appeared calm, the people quiet but welcoming, the rhythm of life steady and unbroken. Nothing suggested that the place held anything beyond what could be seen. And yet, as evening approached, they would notice small differences. The way conversations ended earlier than expected, the way doors closed before darkness had fully settled, the way no one remained outside once the lanterns were lit. If they asked, they would receive no clear answer, only a gentle response. It is better to rest early here. Nothing more. No explanation. No story. Only the quiet suggestion that the night was not meant to be shared in the same way as the day. Most accepted this without question. Some did not. There were always a few who lingered longer than they should have, not out of defiance, but out of curiosity, a desire to understand what had not been explained. And in those moments the warnings returned, not louder, not stronger, but closer, as though they had been waiting. If the night grows too still, do not look toward the road. The words did not carry urgency. They did not demand obedience. They simply remained, and those who heard them felt something shift within themselves. A quiet hesitation, a subtle awareness that something beyond their understanding had already been decided. Inside the homes, as the night deepened, the fragments of these warnings settled into silence once more. They did not repeat. They did not echo. They became part of the stillness itself. Outside, the road waited, unchanged, unlit. And yet, as the air grew heavier and the wind failed to return, the space around it seemed to hold something unseen. Not movement, not sound, but presence. A presence that did not arrive suddenly, but had always been there, hidden beneath the ordinary shape of the world, waiting for the moment when everything else grew quiet enough to reveal it. And within that deepening stillness, the meaning of the warnings became something more than words. They became a boundary, a line not drawn upon the earth, but understood without being seen. A line that, once crossed in the wrong way, could not be crossed back. The night did not arrive all at once. It deepened slowly, layer by layer, as though the world itself were settling into something quieter than darkness alone. The lanterns that marked the village held their steady glow, each one a small circle of warmth surrounded by a widening stillness. Inside the homes, the rhythm of the evening continued. Soft voices, quiet movements, the gentle sounds of daily life folding into rest. Nothing appeared out of place. And yet, beyond the walls of wood and paper, something had already begun to change. At first, it was almost nothing. A subtle shift in the air. The wind, which had moved gently through the grasses only moments before, began to weaken. Its presence faded not with a final movement, but with an absence. The leaves of distant trees, which had whispered softly in the dark, grew still, then quieter, then silent. The grasses at the edge of the road no longer bent. They stood upright, unmoving, as though held in place by something unseen. The lantern flames, once flickering with the faint breath of the evening air, steadied. Their light no longer wavered. It remained fixed, as though the space around them had been sealed. The silence that followed was not immediate. It gathered, slowly, one sound at a time. The distant flow of water grew faint. The insects that had filled the night with quiet rhythm fell silent. Even the small, unnoticed sounds, the shifting of wood, the settling of earth seemed to withdraw, leaving behind a stillness that felt complete. It was not empty. It was full, full of something that did not move, yet made its presence known in the absence of everything else.
Within the village, this change did not go unnoticed,
though no one spoke of it. The awareness moved quietly from one space to another. A hand paused for a moment before setting down a bowl. A voice lowered further, as though instinctively adjusting to the weight of the silence. A lantern was moved slightly away from a doorway. A window was covered just a little more. These were small actions, barely noticeable, yet each one carried the same quiet understanding.
The night had changed.
Not in darkness, but in nature. Beyond the final row of houses, the road lay still. Its surface, marked by the passage of the day, now held no movement. The edges, once softened by wind and grass, appeared sharper, more defined, as though the world had drawn its attention toward it. The space around it felt deeper, not darker, but farther,
as though the road no longer ended where it should.
And within that deepening stillness, something else began to emerge. Not sound, not yet, but the suggestion of it. A faint sense that the silence itself was no longer passive, that it was not simply the absence of movement, but the beginning of something that had not yet revealed itself. The air grew heavier, not with weight, but with presence. Breathing felt slower, more deliberate,
as though even that small act had become something that should not be done too quickly.
Inside the homes, the villagers remained still, not frozen, not afraid, but aware.
They did not move toward the doors. They did not approach the windows, and they did not look toward the road. There was no need to.
Because the moment had arrived, the moment when the night was no longer part of the world they knew, and though nothing had yet appeared, everything had already begun. For a long time, nothing followed. The stillness remained complete, stretching across the village and the fields beyond it without interruption. The lantern light held steady. The air did not move. Even the faint sense of time seemed to slow, as though it had chosen not to pass too quickly through that moment. Then, somewhere far along the road, something changed.
It was not immediate,
not clear. At first, it could not even be called a sound.
It was only a difference, a shift within the silence itself, so slight that it might have been imagined, a faint disturbance, as though something had moved within the distance too quietly to be heard, yet not so quietly that it could be ignored entirely. It came once, then nothing.
The stillness returned, complete as before, and yet, once noticed, it did not leave. The mind held it, turned it, tried to understand it. Then, after a long pause, it came again.
A little clearer this time.
Not loud, not sharp, but present.
A soft rhythm, slow, measured, not quite footsteps, not quite anything familiar.
It did not belong to the wind.
The wind had already left.
It did not belong to animals. There was no movement among them, and it did not belong to anything that the village knew as part of its night. The sound did not approach in a straight line.
It seemed to exist at a distance, yet also closer than expected, as though it did not travel through the air in the way ordinary sound would. It appeared, then faded, then appeared again,
each time slightly more defined. Within the homes, the villagers remained still. No one spoke.
No one moved toward the doors.
The sound was not something to be followed, nor something to be confirmed.
It simply existed, and that was enough.
The rhythm continued.
Slow,
even,
unchanging. It carried no urgency,
no intention that could be understood, and yet, with each passing moment, it became clearer that it was not random.
It was order,
deliberate, as though something were moving along the road with purpose, guided by a pattern that did not belong to the human world. A faint light appeared next, far beyond the reach of the village lanterns. At first, it was no more than a suggestion, a softness within the darkness, not bright enough to be called a flame,
not steady enough to be a reflection. It shifted gently, as though it were moving,
but its movement did not follow the rhythm of the sound.
It did not flicker.
It did not waver. It simply remained, growing slightly more visible with each passing moment. The sound continued.
The light remained.
And between them, something began to take form. Not fully, not yet, only the suggestion of presence.
A sense that what approached was not singular.
Not one movement, but many,
layered together,
bound by the same quiet rhythm.
Inside the village, the silence deepened further, not because there was no sound,
but because the sound that existed did not belong to anything that could be answered.
No one called out.
No one questioned.
There was nothing to be done.
Only to remain.
Still, unseen,
unnoticed.
The rhythm grew closer.
The faint light widened.
And though nothing had yet revealed itself completely, the understanding settled into place.
What had been spoken of in fragments, what had been carried in quiet warnings had begun. The light did not grow brighter. It spread. What had once been a single faint presence in the distance now revealed itself as something layered, something composed of many small sources that moved together without merging. Each one held its own place, its own quiet glow, yet none stood alone. They advanced slowly along the road,
not hurried,
not uncertain. Their movement followed the same rhythm as the distant sound measured, deliberate, unbroken, and as they drew closer, the darkness around them did not retreat.
It deepened. The space along the road seemed to widen, as though making room for what approached.
The edges of the path lost their clarity, blending into a depth that no longer belonged to the land itself.
The first shapes began to form within the glow,
not fully,
not clearly,
only outlines, impressions. Something tall, passing through the dim light without casting a shadow. Something low, moving in uneven patterns close to the ground. Something that did not follow the shape of a body at all, yet occupied space as though it did.
They did not arrive all at once. They revealed themselves slowly, piece by piece, as though the eye could only hold so much of them at a time.
The rhythm continued,
soft, steady, unchanging.
And with each passing moment, it became clear this was not a gathering, not a wandering.
It was a procession, ordered, intentional, endless.
The figures moved along the road without hesitation, without pause. Each one followed the same path, yet none moved in exactly the same way. Some glided without sound, their forms barely touching the ground. Others shifted with uneven motion, rising and falling in patterns that did not belong to walking. There were shapes that resembled people, but not entirely. Their outlines were too still, too complete, as though they had been formed from something other than flesh. There were smaller figures too,
quick,
light, their movement sharp and sudden, yet bound to the same slow rhythm as everything else. And there were others that could not be compared to anything familiar. Forms that bent where nothing should bend, movements that seemed to begin before they ended, presences that existed more in suggestion than in shape.
They passed without sound.
Even the rhythm that had announced their approach did not seem to come from them directly. It existed around them, within them, as though it were part of something larger than their individual movement. The faint lights moved with them,
not held, not carried, but accompanying,
floating beside them, behind them, within them.
Each glow steady, each one unchanged, as though it were not affected by the world it passed through.
Inside the homes, the villagers remained still.
No one moved closer.
No one sought to see more clearly. The understanding held.
This was not something to be observed,
not something to be followed.
The warnings remained, not as words, but as presence.
Do not look, do not listen, do not be seen. Outside, the procession continued.
It did not slow.
It did not falter. It moved as though it had always been moving, as though the road had always belonged to it in moments like this. And as more of it came into view, the realization deepened. There was no clear beginning, no visible end, only the steady passage of something that did not belong to the village, yet passed through it all the same. The night did not resist it.
The world did not react to it.
Everything simply allowed it to pass,
as though it were not an intrusion, but a return.
As the procession moved further along the road, the shapes within it became clearer, not fully, never fully, but enough to be understood in fragments. Each presence carried its own form, its own way of moving through the stillness, yet all remained bound to the same quiet rhythm. No voice guided them, no signal directed them, and yet they did not stray.
They followed, as though the path had already been decided long before the village had ever been built.
Some appeared tall and narrow, their forms rising above the others, moving with a smooth, unbroken motion.
Their outlines suggested the shape of a person, but something within them felt distant, as though the idea of a body had been remembered rather than lived. They did not turn. They did not look. They passed.
Others moved closer to the ground,
small, quick,
their shapes uneven, shifting slightly with each movement. They advanced in short bursts, pausing only long enough to remain within the rhythm before continuing again.
There were figures that seemed to carry weight, not in their steps, but in their presence.
They moved more slowly than the others, their forms dense, as though something unseen pressed them toward the earth. Yet even in that heaviness, they did not fall behind. The rhythm held them, kept them in place, and there were those that did not seem to move at all, shapes that hovered within the procession, drifting slightly above the road, their edges soft and uncertain. They appeared and disappeared within the faint glow, never fully forming, yet never entirely gone.
It was not possible to count them,
not because they were too many, but because they did not present themselves in a way that could be measured. Each time one shape became clear, another faded. Each time something was understood, something else replaced it.
The procession did not allow itself to be grasped as a whole.
It could only be witnessed in parts. The faint lights that moved among them remained constant. Some hovered near the ground. Others floated higher, aligning themselves with the taller forms. None flickered,
none dimmed. They held their quiet glow as though untouched by the world around them.
At times, the light would fall across one of the shapes just enough to reveal more, a suggestion of a face that did not hold expression, an outline that shifted too slowly to be seen clearly, a presence that seemed to exist between form and absence.
Then it would pass,
returning to something less defined. The road beneath them remained unchanged. No sound marked their movement.
No imprint followed their passing. It was as though they did not interact with the ground at all, even as they moved along it.
Inside the village, the stillness held. Not a single door opened.
Not a single lantern was moved. The quiet discipline of the place remained unbroken, as though the village itself understood that this moment did not belong to it.
And yet, despite the silence, despite the distance kept between the homes and the road, there was an awareness, a quiet sense that what moved beyond the edge of the village was not unaware of the village itself, that it passed not because the village existed, but because the village stood in its path. The procession continued,
unchanged, uninterrupted.
There was no sign that it would end,
no shift in its rhythm,
no break in its form, only the steady passage of the many moving together as one along a road that no longer belonged to the world of the living. And within that endless movement, something deeper began to settle into place. Not fear, not wonder, but realization.
This was not an event,
not a rare occurrence, not something that happened by chance. It was something that returned.
Again, and again, and again.
The procession did not slow. It did not change.
It did not acknowledge the distance it had already crossed. It continued, steady,
unbroken,
as though it had always been moving, long before the village had settled beneath the mountains, long before the road had been shaped by human footsteps. Time began to lose its meaning. There was no clear measure of how long the movement had lasted.
The rhythm remained the same, neither quickening nor fading, and without variation. It no longer marked the passing of moments.
It simply existed, a constant.
The The faint lights drifted forward in quiet alignment, their glow neither growing nor diminishing. The shapes that followed them moved without hesitation, without pause, each one maintaining its place within the procession as though guided by something unseen. There was no beginning to trace,
no origin to follow.
The road stretched into darkness behind them, and whatever lay beyond that darkness remained hidden, unreachable.
And ahead there was no end.
Only more of the same quiet movement, disappearing into a distance that did not seem to grow closer. The mind, if it tried to follow, would lose its place. Each figure that passed seemed to replace the one before it.
Each moment felt identical to the last, yet not in a way that created repetition. It was not a cycle. It was a continuation,
unbroken,
unchanging.
Within the village, the stillness remained absolute. No voice disturbed it. No movement broke it. Even the small, natural shifts of the night, the settling of wood, the soft breath of the earth had withdrawn completely. Everything that belonged to the living had stepped back, left space, allowed the passage. There was something in that quiet that went beyond caution.
It was not simply the act of remaining unseen. It was recognition.
A silent acknowledgement that what moved along the road did not belong to the same world, and yet it passed through it all the same. The shapes within the procession continued to reveal themselves in fragments. One might become clearer for a moment, a tall presence with a form that suggested limbs, yet moved without the motion of joints. Another might flicker at the edge of sight, its shape too brief to hold, yet distinct enough to be remembered. Some seemed to carry something, not objects, not tools, but a presence within their form, as though they contained more than what could be seen. Others appeared empty,
hollow,
their outlines clear, yet their presence distant, as though they existed without weight, without substance. And still they moved together, bound by the same rhythm,
held within the same passage.
The faint lights shifted slightly as they advanced, sometimes aligning in quiet patterns that suggested order, though no clear structure could be understood. At times, they appeared closer together, as though gathering. Then they would spread again, returning to their quiet separation. The road itself seemed unchanged beneath them.
No mark remained.
No trace was left behind.
The earth did not remember their passing, and yet the air did.
The stillness carried something different now, a deeper presence,
a sense that the world itself had shifted slightly, just enough to allow this movement to exist.
And in that subtle change, another realization emerged.
The procession was not passing through the village. The village was standing within its path. The road did not belong to the village in this moment.
It belonged to the procession, and everything else, the houses,
the lanterns,
the people within them, had simply stepped aside. The movement continued,
endless,
unbroken, and within it, the sense of something ancient grew stronger, not in age, but in nature.
As though this passage had no beginning,
and would have no end. The rhythm did not belong to sound alone.
It settled deeper than that. It moved through the air, through the ground, through the quiet space that held everything together. It could be felt even when it was no longer clearly heard, as though it had become part of the night itself. Slow, measured, unchanging. It did not rise. It did not fall. It simply continued.
And in that continuation, something within it began to reveal itself, not through variation, but through constancy. The longer it remained, the more it became clear that this rhythm was not guiding the procession.
It was the procession.
Each movement aligned with it perfectly.
Each presence followed it without deviation.
There was no hesitation, no delay, no difference in pace. Everything belonged to it. The shapes that passed along the road no longer appeared as separate beings, not entirely.
Though their forms remained distinct in fragments, there was a growing sense that they were not moving individually.
They were part of something larger, something that could not be seen as a whole, yet was felt in every moment of their passing. The procession was not made of many.
It was one,
a single movement unfolding across the road in countless forms.
The faint light seemed to pulse gently within this rhythm, not flickering, not changing,
but aligning. At times, they appeared to draw closer together, forming quiet patterns that held for only a moment before dissolving again into their steady forward motion. There was no signal for this, no beginning or end to these subtle shifts.
They simply occurred, then passed.
The air remained heavy with stillness. Breathing felt slower, more deliberate, as though the body itself had begun to follow the rhythm that moved through the night.
Even the act of remaining still required attention, as though any unnecessary movement might disturb something that should not be disturbed.
Inside the homes, the villagers did not sleep,
not fully.
Their rest was light, suspended somewhere between waking and dreaming. Awareness lingered, quiet but present, as though the mind refused to release its hold on the moment.
No one rose.
No one approached the doors.
No one looked toward the road. The boundary held, unseen, unspoken, yet absolute.
Outside, the procession continued without change.
There was no sign that it had reached its center.
No indication that it would soon pass entirely.
It existed as though it had no middle, no conclusion.
Only continuation. At times, a shape would seem to slow, not enough to break the rhythm, but enough to be noticed.
Then it would return,
perfectly aligned once more. At times, a light would appear closer to the edge of the road, as though drifting outward. Then it would settle back into place. Nothing remained outside the pattern for long. Everything returned. Everything belonged. The road itself no longer felt like a path. It had become something else, a space through which this movement passed, a boundary between what was seen and what was not, a line that did not separate two places, but two states of existence. And within that space, the rhythm held everything together, unbroken,
endless, complete.
The night did not resist it.
The village did not interrupt it.
The world simply allowed it to continue.
As though it had done so countless times before.
As though it would do so countless times again. And within that quiet certainty, something settled deeper into the understanding of the place. This was not an occurrence to be feared, nor one to be questioned. It was something to be endured, something to be allowed, something to be passed through without acknowledgement, because to notice it too clearly or follow it too closely would be to step beyond the boundary that had always been held. And some boundaries, once crossed, did not return to their place. The rhythm continued,
steady,
unfading,
as though the night itself had become its echo.
Until this moment, the night had belonged to distance. Everything that passed along the road had remained just beyond reach, seen only in fragments, understood only through presence.
The boundary between the village and the procession had held without effort, quiet and complete.
But there are moments, even within such stillness, when awareness shifts.
Not by choice, not by intention,
but by something smaller, something almost unnoticeable, a slight change in attention, a breath taken a moment too slowly,
a thought that lingers just a little longer than it should.
Within one of the homes, near the edge of the village, a presence remained more awake than the others.
Not restless,
not alert, simply aware. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lantern placed carefully near the wall. Its light was steady, untouched by any movement of air.
Shadows rested quietly along the edges of the space, unmoving, as though they had settled into their place and chosen not to shift.
Everything appeared as it should, and yet something felt different.
Not within the room,
but beyond it, a quiet pull, subtle,
distant,
as though something outside had begun to draw attention, not through sound or movement, but through absence.
The absence of change, the absence of variation.
The rhythm that had filled the night had become so constant, so unbroken, that it no longer remained outside. It settled inward, became part of thought, part of awareness, and within that awareness, something began to form.
A question, not spoken,
not fully shaped, but present, a quiet curiosity, rising without intention. What is passing? The thought did not belong.
It was not part of the understanding that had been carried through the village.
It did not follow the warnings that had been given, nor the habits that had been learned over time. It simply appeared, and once it did not leave. The presence within the room remained still.
No movement followed the thought. No step was taken toward the door. No hand reached for the window.
And yet, something had already shifted.
The boundary, which had been held so effortlessly before, now felt closer, thinner.
As though awareness itself had moved toward it. Outside, the procession continued.
Unchanged, the rhythm remained steady.
The faint lights drifted forward in their quiet alignment. The shapes passed one after another, endless, unbroken. Nothing had altered in the world beyond the home, and yet within it, something had begun, a moment of noticing.
Small,
silent,
but real.
The presence near the wall allowed its gaze to move, only slightly, not toward the door.
Not directly, but in a way that brought the outside just a little closer to thought.
The window remained covered. The door remained closed.
Nothing had been done.
And yet, the distance between inside and outside had changed. The awareness of the road had entered the space, and with it, the memory of the warnings returned.
Not as words,
but as feeling. Do not look. Do not listen. Do not be seen.
The understanding remained, clear,
unbroken. And yet, the curiosity did not fade.
It remained, quiet, persistent, as though it had been waiting for this moment.
The rhythm outside continued.
Steady, unending.
And within that rhythm something shifted again.
Not in the procession,
but in perception. A faint change in the way the light moved. A slight variation in the shapes that passed.
Nothing clear.
Nothing certain.
But enough to suggest that what had been distant was no longer entirely so.
The presence within the room remained still, breath slow, movement absent, and yet awareness had already crossed the first boundary, not of space,
but of attention.
And once something is noticed, even in the smallest way, it cannot return to being unseen. The awareness did not recede. It remained where it had settled, quiet, steady, and closer than before. The room itself had not changed. The lantern still held its small, unwavering glow. The walls remained still. The covered window allowed only a softened suggestion of the night beyond.
And yet, the distance between inside and outside no longer felt complete. It had thinned, not in form,
but in feeling. The presence within the room did not move, not toward the door, not toward the window, but the stillness had become different.
It was no longer simply rest.
It had become attention.
Outside, the rhythm continued,
unbroken,
steady. Each movement along the road aligned perfectly with it, each faint light drifting forward without deviation.
The procession did not pause. It did not shift in response to anything within the village. It remained as it had always been. And yet, from within the room, something began to change.
Not in what was seen, but in what was almost seen.
The edge of perception shifted slightly, as though something just beyond view had moved closer, not physically, but in presence. The faint glow from the road seemed to press gently against the boundary of the window, not entering, not crossing, but remaining near enough to be felt. A shape passed, not visible,
but sensed, a movement that did not disturb the air, yet left behind the quiet certainty that something had been there. The breath within the room slowed further, careful, measured,
as though even that small act required intention.
The warnings returned again, clearer now, not spoken, but understood. If you see them, do not let them see you.
The meaning settled deeper this time.
Not as guidance, but as necessity. The presence within the room remained perfectly still.
No shift of weight, no change in position.
Nothing that could be noticed.
And yet, the awareness continued to lean outward, only slightly, only enough to feel the nearness of what passed beyond the walls. The procession did not break.
It did not react.
But within its movement, there were moments, brief, uncertain, where something seemed to align, a shape that moved just a little closer to the edge of the road, a faint light that drifted slightly nearer to the village than the others.
Nothing clear, nothing that could be confirmed, but enough to suggest that the distance was not as fixed as it had once been. The boundary held, but it was no longer untouched.
The air in the room remained still, yet it felt different. Not heavier, not colder, but aware, as though something beyond the walls existed in a way that could not be entirely separated from what lay within. The presence did not look.
Not directly,
not fully, but the awareness of looking had already begun.
And that alone was enough to bring the moment closer. Outside, the shapes continued to pass,
endless, unbroken. And among them, one seemed to shift, not stopping,
not turning,
but altering, a slight change in alignment, a faint deviation within the rhythm,
so small it could have been nothing,
so brief it could not be held,
and yet it remained, a possibility
that something within the procession had noticed, not the movement,
not the presence,
but the awareness itself. The breath slowed further,
until it was barely there.
The stillness in the room became absolute. Not a single part of it moved.
Not even in thought.
Because now the understanding had changed. This was no longer about seeing.
It was about not being seen, and the difference between the two was as thin as the boundary that separated the room from the road.
The moment stretched,
held,
suspended between what was and what might be, and then nothing changed. The rhythm continued.
The shapes passed.
The faint lights moved forward. Whatever had shifted returned to its place. Or perhaps it had never moved at all.
The uncertainty remained, but the danger passed without revealing itself. Slowly, quietly,
the awareness within the room began to settle. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to return to stillness without attention. Enough to allow the boundary to hold once more. Outside, the procession continued as it always had, unbroken,
unending, and within the village, the quiet remained.
But now it carried something more.
A memory not of what had been seen, but of what had almost been.
The rhythm did not end.
It softened, so gradually that its change could not be marked by a single moment.
It did not stop, nor did it break. It simply began to lose its hold on the air, as though the night itself were releasing it, one quiet layer at a time. The procession continued, but something within it had shifted. The shapes that had once held their place in faint clarity now began to thin. Their edges, already uncertain, grew softer still.
Where one form had passed, another followed, but the distance between them seemed to stretch, not in space, but in presence.
The movement remained, the certainty did not. The faint lights that had guided the passage drifted forward as before, yet their glow no longer pressed against the darkness in the same way. They appeared farther away, even when they were not. Their steady brightness did not fade, but its weight lessened, as though it no longer needed to be seen. The road, which had held the procession so completely, began to return, not visibly,
not in shape,
but in feeling. Its depth lessened,
its distance drew closer, as though it were remembering its place within the world of the village.
Inside the homes, the stillness remained,
but it had changed as well.
The awareness that had filled the space quiet, careful, attentive began to loosen. Breathing, once measured and deliberate, grew softer, less controlled. The tension that had never been named began to fade, not because it had been released, but because it was no longer required. No one moved, not yet. The understanding held.
Wait.
Allow it to pass fully. Do not return too soon. Outside, the procession continued its quiet retreat.
It did not turn. It did not reverse.
It simply moved forward, carrying itself farther into the darkness beyond the village, and as it did, The sense of its presence diminished, not because it had lessened, but because it no longer occupied the same space.
It was leaving, not quickly,
Not completely.
but steadily.
The shapes grew more difficult to hold. What had once been seen in fragments now slipped more easily from perception. A form would appear, then fade before it could be understood. A light would drift into view, then dissolve into the distance without leaving a trace.
The rhythms softened further. What had once filled the night now lingered only at its edges, a faint echo,
A memory of movement. The air, which had remained perfectly still, began to shift, not enough to be called wind,
but enough to suggest that the stillness was no longer absolute.
The lantern flames inside the homes responded first. A slight tremor,
Then another,
barely noticeable,
but real.
The world was beginning to return. The boundary that had separated the village from the procession remained, but its weight had changed.
It no longer felt like a line that could not be crossed.
It felt like something that had already been respected, and now something that could begin to settle back into its place.
Outside, the final shapes passed.
Or perhaps they did not. Perhaps they simply became too distant to be seen. The road stretched into darkness once more, but the depth that had once filled it no longer remained.
It was a path again, quiet,
Empty.
unclaimed,
The faint lights disappeared completely,
not one by one,
but all at once,
as though they had never existed at all.
and in their absence the night shifted. The silence remained,
But it was no longer full. It was open,
the kind of silence that belonged to rest, to sleep, to the natural passing of time. The procession had not ended. It had moved on,
and the village, which had stood quietly within its path, now remained behind, unchanged.
and yet not entirely the same. For a time, the stillness remained, not the deep stillness that had filled the night before, but something lighter, something that no longer carried the same quiet weight.
It lingered gently across the village, as though the world had not yet decided to move again.
Then, slowly, almost without notice, something changed.
The air shifted.
Not in a single movement, but in a subtle return. A faint breath of wind passed through the grasses at the edge of the road, bending them slightly before releasing them again. The motion was small, but it carried with it a quiet certainty. The stillness had ended. The lantern flames responded next. Where they had once held perfectly still, they now trembled faintly, their light shifting in small, uneven patterns. The glow they cast no longer remained fixed. It moved again, soft and familiar, returning to the rhythm of ordinary night. Inside the homes, the change was felt before it was understood. Breathing, once careful and deliberate, eased without effort.
The tension that had rested quietly in the body began to dissolve, not in a single moment, but gradually, as though it had never been fully present to begin with.
No one rose immediately.
No one moved toward the doors. The understanding remained. Wait,
Let the night return completely.
only then, but even without movement, the difference was clear.
The silence no longer pressed inward. It no longer held.
It opened,
The distant sound of water returned first,
soft,
continuous.
barely there.
Then, somewhere farther away, an insect broke the quiet with a faint, uneven rhythm. It paused, then continued, as though testing the air before fully returning to it. The world, which had stepped back, began to step forward again,
Outside, the road lay empty.
its surface unchanged, though it no longer held the depth it once had. The darkness along its edges felt closer now, contained once more within the shape of the land.
It was a path again.
Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, there was a quiet awareness that remained, not of what had passed.
But of where it had passed.
The space carried a memory, not visible, not tangible, but present in the way the air moved across it, in the way the silence had once settled so completely. Inside the homes, a hand shifted slightly, a breath deepened, a quiet movement, small enough to be unnoticed, yet enough to mark the return of ordinary presence.
The night resumed,
Not as it had been before,
but close enough.
The lanterns continued to burn, their light now moving gently with the air. Shadows shifted once more along the walls, no longer fixed in place. Time, which had seemed to pause, began to move again.
Slowly, naturally, as though it had never stopped, and with that movement came a quiet release.
The moment had passed. The procession had moved beyond the village.
The boundary had held. Nothing had been seen. Nothing had been taken.
The understanding settled into place once more.
Not spoken, not shared,
simply known. Beyond the houses, the road remained silent, empty,
unchanged.
And yet it carried something that would not leave, a quiet memory, not of what it had become, but of what it would become again. Because the night, though it had returned to stillness, was not the same as the nights that came before. It had revealed something, not fully,
not clearly,
but enough
to remain. And as the hours passed and the village rested once more within the quiet rhythm of the world, the understanding held.
The road would not always belong to them. The night would not always remain empty. And when the stillness returned in the same quiet way, the procession would return with it. After the final shape had faded beyond sight, the night did not return all at once.
It remained suspended,
as though something of what had passed still rested within it. The road lay empty, unchanged in form, and yet it did not feel entirely as it had before. There was a quiet depth that lingered in the air above it, not visible, not measurable, but present in the same way a distant sound remains even after it has faded beyond hearing. The grasses at its edges moved again, but more slowly now, as though remembering the stillness they had held. Each blade bent gently with the returning wind, then settled again, not quite as freely as before. The lanterns continued to burn. Their light flickered softly, casting small shifting patterns onto the ground. But even in their movement there was a hesitation, a softness,
as though the air itself had not yet fully returned to what it had been.
Inside the homes, the quiet remained, not the careful stillness of before, but something gentler, something deeper, the kind of quiet that follows after something has passed, when there is no need to listen any more, yet the listening does not entirely leave.
A breath was taken, slow, unforced, and then another.
The rhythm of the body returned without being called. The awareness that had once been held so carefully began to loosen, not all at once, but gradually,
as though it had been carried for longer than it realized.
The memory of the procession did not remain in images.
It did not return as clear forms or movements.
Instead, it lingered as a feeling, a quiet understanding that something had passed through the space of the world without disturbing it,
without leaving a mark, and yet not without presence. Outside, the road held its silence.
But now it was a different silence, not full, not waiting,
but resting.
The kind of silence that belongs to something that has already completed its movement. The night deepened,
gently, naturally.
The sky stretched wide above the village, unchanged in its quiet expanse. Stars remained where they had always been,
distant,
unmoving, unaffected,
as though nothing below them had shifted at all.
And perhaps in that distance nothing had. The world beyond the village continued without pause, without awareness of what had passed. But here, within the quiet space beneath the mountains, something had settled.
Not as memory, not as knowledge,
but as part of the rhythm itself.
A subtle addition.
A quiet layer beneath everything that would follow. The wind moved more freely now.
The grasses bent without hesitation.
The lantern flames flickered as they always had, and yet the night felt deeper, not darker, but more complete,
as though it held within it both what had passed and what would come again. The road rested, still,
empty, but no longer untouched, because even without marks, even without trace, there are moments that remain within the spaces they pass through, moments that do not leave, but settle,
quietly,
like everything else in that place. And as the night continued, and the village slowly returned to rest, the final traces of the procession faded completely, not into distance, but into stillness.
Morning arrived as it always did, quietly, without memory.
A pale light gathered along the horizon, touching the edges of the mountains before drifting down into the village. The air carried the cool stillness of early day, soft and undisturbed, as though the night had passed without leaving anything behind. Doors opened, one, then another. Footsteps followed, slow at first, then steady, as the rhythm of the day returned.
The village stood, familiar, unchanged.
Smoke rose once more from the rooftops, thin and pale against the morning sky. The scent of cooking fires spread gently through the narrow paths, settling into the spaces between the homes as it had done countless times before. Voices followed,
Soft, measured.
nothing in them suggested anything unusual. Children stepped outside, their movements light and unguarded. They crossed the paths and wandered toward the edges of the village, their attention drawn to the simple details of the morning, the warmth of the light, the movement of the grasses, the quiet openness of the fields. The road lay as it always had, its surface marked by the faint impressions of the previous day. Though some had softened during the night, the dust had settled evenly, and the grass along its edges moved gently with the returning wind.
Nothing had disturbed it. Nothing remained.
And yet, there was something, not visible, not certain, but present. A small difference, a quiet awareness carried in the way the villagers moved near it. No one lingered along its length. No one paused at its edge. The road was crossed, as it always had been, but never held,
never kept.
A fisherman passed over it on his way toward the river, his steps steady and unthinking. A child followed shortly after, their movement quick and light, leaving small, uneven marks in the dust.
The path accepted them without resistance, as though nothing had ever passed along it in the night.
As though it had always belonged only to them. And yet, in the quiet space between these ordinary movements, something remained.
Not in the ground, not in the air, but in memory.
A memory that did not take form as thought, that did not rise into words,
but settled gently into the rhythm of the village.
A door was closed a little more carefully.
A lantern was adjusted slightly, though it was no longer needed. A glance toward the road stopped just short of fully turning.
Small things, unnoticed,
but real.
The elders moved as they always had, their steps slow, their presence quiet. They did not speak of the night. They did not gather others to explain what had passed.
They simply continued, as though nothing had occurred.
And perhaps, in the way that mattered most, nothing had.
The village remained.
The mountain stood. The road stretched along its familiar path. Everything appeared as it should. But beneath that appearance, the understanding held.
The night had not been empty. The road had not been still.
And though nothing had been seen clearly, something had passed. Something that did not belong to the day.
The light of morning grew stronger.
The shadows shortened. The warmth of the sun spread across the fields, dissolving the last traces of the night's cool air. Time moved forward, as it always did, and with it, the village returned fully to itself.
Yet even within that return, there was a quiet difference.
A subtle shift in the way the world was held, as though the land itself remembered something that could not be spoken, something that did not need to be, because it would come again.
Not announced, not expected, but certain.
As certain as the turning of day into night, as certain as the quiet rhythm of the village beneath the mountains. And when it came, the road would no longer be empty. The day passed as it always did. Light moved across the village, warming the narrow paths and settling gently over the rooftops. The fields beyond the houses filled with quiet movement, and the road carried the steady rhythm of footsteps once more. Voices rose and fell, tools met the earth, and the ordinary flow of life returned without interruption. Nothing remained of the night.
Nothing that could be seen.
And yet, as the hours stretched and the light slowly began to soften once again, something beneath the surface remained unchanged, not visible,
not spoken,
but present. The sun lowered toward the mountains. Shadows lengthened across the fields, stretching quietly along the path of the road. The warmth of the day began to fade, replaced by the cooler air of evening. The village, without pause or instruction, began its slow return inward. Lanterns were prepared, placed,
hung, waiting, the same rhythm,
the same quiet understanding. Children returned from the open paths. Voices softened. Doors remained open for a moment longer, then closed. The sky deepened.
Gold into amber,
amber into blue, and within that change, something familiar began to settle once more. Not fear, not expectation, but recognition. The road lay beyond the houses, unchanged in its form. Its surface held the marks of the day. Its edges bent gently with the wind. It appeared as it always had, and yet the space around it felt different. Not yet, but soon. A breeze moved through the grasses,
soft, fleeting, then passed.
The lanterns were lit, one by one, their small flames steady against the growing dark. The village withdrew,
quietly,
completely. The final sounds of the day faded into stillness, and for a moment the world seemed balanced between what had been and what would return. The air grew quieter, not empty, not yet, but waiting. Inside the homes, the understanding remained,
not as thought, not as memory,
but as part of the rhythm itself.
A door was checked,
a window covered,
a lantern placed just far enough from the edge of the path.
No one spoke, no one needed to, because the pattern had not changed. It had only paused. The night deepened, and with it, the possibility returned. The wind would fall still again. The grasses would cease their movement. The lantern flames would hold steady, untouched by air. And beyond the reach of the village, along the quiet curve of the road, something would begin.
Not announced, not revealed all at once,
but present, as it had always been. The procession would return.
Slow, measured,
unbroken. The many that walk would pass once more through the space that did not belong to them alone, and the village would remain
quiet, still, unseen,
because that is how it had always been, and that is how it would remain.
There are nights that belong to the living,
and there are nights that do not. There are paths that carry footsteps, and there are paths that carry something else entirely. And when the world grows still enough, when the wind forgets to move, when the silence deepens beyond the shape of rest, the road will no longer be empty, and something will pass along it once more, without sound, without beginning, without end. And now the night rests again, not as it was before, but as something softer, something that has already passed through stillness and returned from it. The road lies beneath the open sky, unchanged in its shape, quiet in its presence, no longer carrying what moved along it. The lanterns continue to glow, their light no longer held in perfect stillness, but breathing gently with the air that has returned. Each small movement of flame casts a shifting pattern across the ground, soft and unhurried, as though time itself has slowed to match it. Nothing calls for attention now.
Nothing asks to be followed.
The night no longer holds anything hidden.
It simply exists, calm, steady, endless.
The mountains remain as they always have, their forms resting quietly against the sky, unchanged by what has passed below them. They do not remember, they do not forget, they simply remain, and beneath them, the village settles once more into its natural rhythm. The doors are closed, the windows softened, the spaces within each home quiet and still. There is no longer a need to listen, no need to remain aware. The moment has passed beyond reach, and with it, the tension that once rested in the air has faded into something gentler. The breath slows,
not by effort, but by ease. Each inhale soft, each exhale quieter than the last.
The body no longer holds itself in stillness. It returns to rest.
Naturally, without thought.
Like the grasses beyond the road that now bend freely once more, guided only by the quiet movement of the wind. The mind, too, begins to drift, no longer reaching outward, no longer holding on to shape or sound. The images of the night fade not into darkness, but into distance. They do not disappear. They simply move farther away, until they are no longer needed, and in their place there's only quiet. A quiet that does not press, a quiet that does not wait, a quiet that simply holds, the kind of stillness that belongs to sleep.
The lantern light softens.
The shadows grow gentle. The world becomes distant, not because it has changed, but because it no longer needs to be held in awareness. Everything continues, far away,
unseen, unheard.
And here there's only rest. Only the slow, steady drifting into a space where nothing needs to be followed, nothing needs to be remembered, nothing needs to be understood. The night stretches onward wide and unbroken, and somewhere far beyond thought, beyond form, beyond even the shape of the story, the road remains,
quiet, still, waiting,
not for this moment,
not for this night,
but for the rhythm that will return again, as it always has, as it always will. And until then there is nothing more to follow, only the calm, endless quiet of the night.